Hey, what's up, nerds? PaulMConti here with a battle report. This is round 1 of Triumph GT. The scenario was Border War, and I was playing my Nurgle versus Death. And this was against Brian Kissel from Masterpiece Miniatures. So this was his list. He was running Grand Host of Nagash. He had a Vampire Lord with a whole bunch of goodies on it. Manfred, 2 Necromancers, 30 Graveguard, 30 Skeletons, 2 units of 5 Dire Wolves, and a unit of 4 Morghast Harbingers. So, yeah, this was kind of scary. He deployed his Graveguard in the grave at the start of the game. He wasn't using a battalion or anything like that, so I outdropped him and got choice, so I opted to go first. Here's how things looked at deployment. On my left flank, I threw Festus, Lord of Afflictions, and 2 units of Blight Kings. Festus was also right next to a piece of arcane terrain. You can see just off to the right there, I put the Great Unclean one on the other side of that to give them both boosted casting at the beginning of that game. And across from that, he had his Morghasts, and Manfred was hanging out on that side as well with some Dire Wolves. Across his center, on his side of the board, you can see that he had his big unit of Skeletons, and as I mentioned, the Graveguard were hanging out in the grave. This is what the middle looked like. I threw my Harbinger of Decay kind of in between where the rest of my stuff was. A unit of 5 Blight Kings on my objective in the back, and I had my unit of 10 Blight Kings with Gutrot Spume hanging out off the board. And you can see in the right flank corner, he had his other unit of Dire Wolves, and his heroes were mostly clustered in the center around that objective. And this is just a look at the right flank. As you can see, there was nothing going on the right flank for me. I was trying to basically bait him into throwing things in that general direction, and then bring on my Gutrot Spume and big unit of Blight Kings to do some shenanigans over there. And it seemed to work out pretty well. He really went really light on that side. He really just had the Dire Wolves, and he had his Graveguard not Graveguard, the Skeletons in the middle. And you'll notice also, my plan for this was also based around the terrain that got rolled. So that little thing in the middle, that little grave-looking thing, that was a piece of Sinister terrain. So that would be the one that you can, or I'm sorry, Sinister or Damned? Whichever the one was where you can do mortal wounds to your guys to give them +1 to hit. That was what was hanging out over there. So I took first turn. I just kind of moved things up. I tried to create a bit of a bubble around my objective and use what I could to deny that grave site that I was right next to. I Mystic Shielded a unit of Blight Kings and ran them pretty far out to grab that objective on the left flank, along with basically moving everything else up. The arcane terrain gave Festus a really nice boost to jump on top of Balewind Vortex, and I believe I also moved the wheel and did some shenanigans with the Great Unclean one. So I was pretty much going hard on this end of the board, and he really put a lot of weight on this end of the board as well. It felt like I was pretty well positioned in general. So first round, I grabbed my objective in my deployment zone in this left objective. I brought in my Blight Kings. They didn't have anything to charge. He kind of deployed in a way that I couldn't really put them anywhere. So they just came on and waited for their next turn to charge off at something. So turn rolled around, and he had a befuddled necromancer, which was super good for me. He took that risk and put a critical hero next to a piece of mystical terrain, which was very good for me. Things very, very quickly got crazy over here on the left flank. Manfred flew in, his Morghast flew in, and his Dire Wolves flew in. Lord of Afflictions tagged the Morghast, and I think Festus may have gotten off Blades. I'm sorry, not Blades of Putrefaction, Curse of the Leper on the Morghast at the top of the round. So they were pretty weakened, and they went down surprisingly quickly for being, I think, like a 420 point unit, something like that. So he brought his Graveguard up in the middle. He didn't really have too many good options as to where those Graveguard would go. And they failed their charge when he brought them up, so they just kind of stuck around there for this first turn. He brought his Dire Wolves up onto the objective on the right flank, so he was able to score the objective in his deployment zone and that right flank objective. So I won priority for this next turn. Of course, I rolled the damage on the damned terrain, made the sacrifice to supercharge those Blight Kings, and that is just like outrageously powerful to do to a bunch of Blight Kings. Really glad they're changing that for 2nd edition. Even though it really benefits me, it's super unfair. So this was what after charges in combat looked like. There was that one damage hanging out from my sacrifice to the damned terrain, and I just nuked that unit of Dire Wolves right off the board. And Gutrot Spume was hanging out in the back, not really doing anything. So over here on this flank, you see I made pretty fast work of those Morghasts. After combat, there was only one left at the end of this turn, and Manfred had started taking some heavy losses on him as well. Over in the center, everything else was just kind of hanging out. I decided to kind of leave well enough alone and see what he was going to do with those Graveguards, see what direction he was going to commit them in, and kind of play from there. He ended up making a move straight up the middle at my Blight Kings, moving towards my deployment zone objective. And as you can see from my battle gauge, or combat gauge, whatever those things are called, he was very intentionally leaving the Great Unclean One out of combat there. He moved his skeletons up and kind of conga lined them as best he could into my Blight Kings on this flank. That did not go well for them at all. I lost a whole bunch of Blight Kings to the Graveguard, though. They were powered up with Dance Macabre, so they were doing like 4 attacks each on 3s and 3s with Rend, so they made pretty quick work of my Blight Kings, which kind of sucked, but, it is what it is. Over here, on the left flank, we finished off Manfred, still doing work on those Morghasts, and the Dire Wolves are kind of low priority. They're really not hitting very hard or doing very much, so, that's where we were at there. Finish off the last Morghast and then started working on the Dire Wolves. Because of the way Manfred had moved in, it did leave one of my units of Blight Kings out in kind of a weird place. So they're kind of far away from everything, which wasn't really that good for me. So he managed to take my rear objective and score big in this battle round. So that was not the best for me at this point in the game. So I was starting to work back from a differential at this point. Over here, did tons of damage into those skeletons, and ended up actually battle shocking the whole unit off the board. And left, I believe that looks like 7 or 8 Blight Kings still left out of that unit. 7 Blight Kings and Gut Rot, it looks like. And they were poised and ready to go do shenanigans. So over here, this was like one of my plays of the day. You'll notice all of a sudden my Lord of Afflictions is in a very strange place. So I had moved the wheel to +2 movement, and then I moved my Great Unclean One up to be within 7 inches of my Lord of Afflictions to give him that movement buff. This is actually kind of like a turn later, but so I took the Lord of Afflictions, I jumped over, ran him towards the Feculent Gnarlmaw to then get to run and charge. So he flew from around where that unit of Blight Kings is, off to the left, over to right next to the Feculent Gnarlmaw, and then he charged over at my opponent's characters in the back. He almost took out that Vampire Lord, but failed by like 1 wound, I believe. Which kind of sucked, but the way he ended up getting positioned, he did manage to take that objective that turn because it was left naked. So that was really good. On his turn, he brought the Graveguard up into my Great Unclean One and started working on him. They made pretty short work of the Great Unclean One, I gotta say. They were really putting a lot of damage into him, and because it was just a single model, they really didn't... He didn't get to hit back, so... and he did not draw any other units into combat, which was pretty good for him. Not great for me. Over here, you can see this was kind of after that combat. He, back on his objective, back at police headquarters, he retreated his Necromancer or Vampire Lord, not sure which that was, one of those guys, out of that combat and kind of into a weird place up on that piece of terrain that was like just outside of 3 inches of my Lord of Afflictions, and retreated one of his Necromancers. So he had 2 to my 1 on that objective and took it back. He piled into my Harbinger of Decay. And this is about actually where the game ended. So, we only played out 3 battle rounds. And we timed out. Big part of why we timed out was just sheer number of dice that got rolled and my opponent having a lot of models on the board. Between Harbinger of Decay's saves and all of the -1 to hits off the Blight Kings and all of the exploding hits off the Blight Kings and his bazillion attacks from the Graveguard and his Deathless Minion saves, we were just rolling lots and lots of dice. This was not a result of like anybody slow playing or anything like that. This was just a game that took a long time because of the sheer mechanics of the game. I feel like I was positioned really well at this point in the game, such that I think, I think I had a good chance at winning if we had played out the rest of the game. Unfortunately, we timed out. I was down by 1 victory point at the time that we timed out, so I took a loss. I did, however, beat him on attrition, so I did kill a whole lot more than he killed of me. I think I had somewhere around 15 out of my 25 Blight Kings still left on the board at the end of the game, along with my Harbinger of Decay, and the Lord of Afflictions, and Gut Rot Spume. So I had a lot of firepower left, and all he really had was a couple of very weak characters and Graveguard. So, all I really needed to do was tie up that Graveguard and prevent it from doing what he wanted it to do. I would have been able to, on my turn, cast Curse of the Leper, hopefully onto that unit of Graveguard to reduce its save, and then blend it with the 2 units of Blight Kings that were over there. That's one of the downsides to taking like big units as opposed to multiple small units, is the whole combat activation thing. He gets to activate all his guys first, but I kind of always will have that ability to swing in afterward, as long as some things survive. So, and I had that big unit of Blight Kings that were going to go jump on the objective in his deployment zone, and Festus was probably going to banish the Balewind Vortex and go run and jump on my rear objective, to prevent him from scoring for a turn after that. So yeah, position recap after this game. I scored 7 tournament points. My opponent scored 13. It put me in 22nd place out of 35. My opponent was 16th out of 35, so I managed to hold him to a relatively minor victory. My opponent's finish at the end of the tournament was 1 win, 3 losses, and he dropped out for round 5, finishing 32nd out of 35. So I was his only victory of the day, and that kind of stings a little bit, especially considering it was a game that timed out. I would have really liked to have seen how this played out, and I was pretty confident about where it was going to end. So that's about it for this one. Unfortunately, not a lot to tell. It was a whole lot of die rolling, and stuff that just took forever. So it was an excellent game, though, and positioned me into the fun bracket for the next round, which will be in the next battle report. I'll catch you all later.